Good afternoon, philosophers. I hope you're well. Today we are going to begin reading the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. Unlike the morning Think Time videos, these Let's Read series, the Think Time videos are on the new Disenthrall 2 channel, but these Let's Read videos, I am keeping an eye on chat, so feel free to pull up a chair and hang out, spend some time as we go through this. This will be a live reading of Michael Malice's newest book with commentary. The first thing I noticed was that the guy that he chose to put on the front of the book is a commie that was wrongfully killed by the state agents. Nevertheless, he was a commie that espoused violent ideas, so I find it hard to get too upset about somebody who espoused violence on innocents, got violence visited upon him as an innocent. Anyway, yeah, it was a red flag, so to speak, when I saw the picture of that guy on the front of the book. I'm pretty sure that it looks like we're going to be covering both commie anarchists and their writings, as well as capitalists like David Friedman and Murray Rothbard and stuff like that. So much like the reading that we did of our Arguments for Liberty, where there were 9 chapters, each written by different people with different moral philosophies, all arguing for liberty, this one is going to be all sorts of different types of people that called themselves anarchists talking about anarchy. Some are definitely not anarchists, but they called themselves that. What's up, Derek? Good to see you. Good afternoon. Okay, so let's get into it. The Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. There's a quote in the beginning by Leon Zolgosz, I believe is how you pronounce it. Quote, "What started the craze to kill was a lecture I heard some little time ago by Emma Goldman. She was in Cleveland, and I and other anarchists went to hear her. She set me on fire. Her doctrine that all rulers should be exterminated was what set me to thinking, so that my head nearly split with the pain. Miss Goldman's words went right through me, and when I left the lecture, I had made up my mind that I would have to do something heroic for the cause I loved." Copyright 2021 Michael Malice. Gross. Contents. Let's see. I'm not going to read the contents, obviously. Chapter 1. Hoc de Anarchie. This is the first chapter by Michael Malice. What's up, Ben? Good to see you. Yeah, we're getting into it. Here we go. Chapter 1. When I was in college, I took a bioethics course. Within the first couple of pages, our textbook there was an illustration charting the spectrum of relationships between morality and the law. One end was marked as legalism, the belief that the law defined what it is moral. The other end was labeled antinomianism, which presented as the view that one's conscience is the arbiter of morality, and that the laws are of no moral relevance. I can't remember if it was the textbook or the professor, but our class discussion opened with, quote, "Since no one believes in antinomianism, the answer is somewhere to the other side of the bar." If an ideology had a name, the odds were quite high that someone did in fact believe in it. Antinomianism in ethics is anarchism in a socio-political context, the belief that the imposition of authority is illegitimate. In one sense, anarchism is nothing more than the declaration that you do not speak for me. Everything else is just implementation. It is impossible to have a radical philosophy without at first sounding like a lunatic or a moron. One of the reasons for this is that most radical philosophies are lunacy, and the rest, for the most part, are moronic. To proclaim earnestly that this, the status quo, doesn't just need tweaks or massive changes, but a fundamental reorganization is an enormously high task to argue for. It's akin to discussing a friend and mentioning that he's very tall. One can perhaps push the envelope with an 8-foot-tall friend, but to claim someone is, say, 20 feet tall or apple feet tall simply wouldn't make any sense. The listener would have no frame of reference to even approximate what was meant to be said. This is what a society without the state sounds like to most people, for they have taken the legitimacy of government for granted all of their lives. An alternative is incomprehensible. Stephen Mulvey says, why read a commie book? We know they are wrong. It's good to read people's opinions that disagree with you, because when you read them, you can strengthen your counter-arguments, or, if you're open-minded, might find that you're wrong and change your position. It's always good to not be afraid to read those positions. Also, the entire book is not commie. There are some in here for sure. All right. There are many common visceral arguments against anarchism. Anarchism is a bad idea because it would lead to a government. Anarchism would mean authoritarian warlords being in charge of society. Anarchism is utopian and hasn't worked anywhere on Earth, except when it has, in which case it doesn't count because a government exists somewhere and therefore made it work. Anarchism cannot work on a large scale, and anarchism cannot work on a small scale either because those areas would immediately be invaded. Inherent in this argument is that governments are, by their nature, invasive and predatory, this being the anarchist view of the nature of government. There are already several countries on Earth that don't have a military, and yes, many rely on foreign governments to protect them against invasion. The argument is that these foreign governments are thereby the real government. But outsourcing the delivery of security is no different than outsourcing the delivery of food. If the security insurers were the real governments, they would be the ones giving and not taking orders. Yet, all this misses the broader point. Anarchism is not a location. Anarchism is a relationship, one in which none of the parties has authority over the other. Every nation is in an anarchist relationship with one another. If a Canadian kills an American in Mexico, there is some agreed-upon mechanism to adjudicate the situation without involving a higher authority, because there is no higher authority to invoke. The situation would be the same if one's, quote, citizenship were voluntary, and as easy to switch as a cell phone provider. Citizenship by geography is a landline technology in a post-smartphone world. At base level, all anarchism claims to do is to resolve one major problem in interpersonal relationships, the forceful interjection of the state. Curing cancer would make things a lot better for many people. Yes, there would be costs. Oncologists would be out of work, and cancer researchers would need new subjects to explore. An anarchist world would still have murderers and thieves and evil men and women. It simply wouldn't put them in a position to enforce their evil on everyone else via getting elected and decreeing the law. Curing cancer does not mean or imply curing diabetes, but neither does it mean or imply that curing cancer is, quote, utopian, or a goal that should not be sought. As Randolph Bourne put it over a century ago, war is the health of the state. But plunder and societal conflict are not far behind when it comes to the government. It's quite easy to stump statists by asking if they would consider it anarchism if there was a system of taxes and state action in place without a police force. How would it work is beside the point. Whether this would be anarchism is the question. If government was a useful mechanism for adjudicating disputes, lawsuits would be as common and as easily resolved as returning an item to the store or quitting one's job. If government was an effective mechanism at solving or preventing crime, crime would be as minor a political issue as fashion is. Everyone needs to feel safe in their person, just as everyone needs clothing. Yet only one is a political issue year in and year out. So, what is the alternative to the state? Private police, or none at all? The original version of anarchism in the left-wing European tradition, is opposed to domination by one person over another and advocates for a society based on mutual aid and complete equality. The more recent version, the actual version, the right capitalists define themselves by opposition to the state. The right anarchists think the left anarchists are naive and lack a fundamental understanding of economics. The left anarchists think the right anarchists aren't anarchists at all, but mere apologists for corporate control and predation. Anarchism has been both a vision of a peaceful, cooperative society and an ideology of revolutionary terror. Since the term itself, anarchism, is a negation, there is a great deal of disagreement on what the positive alternative would look like. The black flag comes in many colors. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. All these hyphenated anarchisms are either self-contradictory or not anarchy. On November 11, 1887, 4 men were hanged by the state of Illinois. They were accused of conspiring to murder because of their common bond in preaching their anarchist views, and they became martyrs for the cause. At the base of the monument erected in their memory are carved the last words of one of them, August Spies. That's the name of the guy on the front of the book. The day will come, he had proclaimed from the gallows, when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today. The Anarchist Handbook is an opportunity for all these many varied voices to speak for themselves from across the decades. These were human beings who saw things differently from their fellow men. They fought and they loved, they lived and they died. They disagreed on much, but they all shared one vision, freedom. They were espousing violence against peaceful people as commie, quote, anarchists. So I have to disagree there. But moving on. Chapter 2. William Godwin, from Inquiry Concerning Political Justice and Its Influence on Morals and Happiness, from 1793. Looks like this begins with a section. It looks like each chapter begins with like a one paragraph from Michael, and then it gets into the text written by the original person. So this part is from Michael. Widely regarded as the first anarchist in modern times, the British William Godwin's Enquiry was one of the most influential political tracts of his era. His devastating critique of social contract theory holds just as true today. As Godwin demonstrates, the social contract is one of those ideas that would come off as incoherent and deranged if one heard them for the first time as an adult. It is alleged an unwritten, quote, contract that presumes both consent, despite none having been given, even in the face of explicit lack of consent, and contains no specific terms, a key element of any contract. Though the social contract is often posited as the origin of a just government, no government in history has ever so much as pretended to have come about as the result of it. All right, and then we begin. Of the social contract. Upon the first statement of the system of a social contract, various difficulties present themselves. Who are the parties to this contract? For whom did they consent? For themselves only, or for others? For how long a time is this contract to be considered as binding? If the consent of every individual be necessary, in what manner is that consent to be given? Is it to be tacit or declared in express terms? Little will be gained for the cause of equality and justice if our ancestors, at the first institution of government, had a right indeed of choosing the system of regulations under which they thought proper to live, but at the same time could barter away the understandings and independence of all that came after them, to the latest posterity. But if the contract must be renewed in each successive generation, what periods must be fixed on for that purpose? And if I obliged to submit to the established government till my turn comes to assent to it, upon what principle is that obligation founded? Surely not upon the contract into which my father entered before I was born. Secondly, what is the nature of the consent in consequence of which I am to be reckoned a party to the frame of any political constitution? It is usually said, quote, that acquiescence is sufficient, and that this acquiescence is to be inferred from my living quietly under the protection of the laws. End quote. But if this be true, an end is as effectively put to all political science, all discrimination of better and worse, as by any system invented by the most slavish sycophant. Upon this hypothesis, every government that is quietly submitted to is a lawful government, whether it be the usurpation of Cromwell or the tyranny of Caligula. Acquiescence is frequently nothing more than a choice on the part of the individual of what he deems the least evil. In many cases, it is not so much as this, since the peasant and the artisan, who form the bulk of a nation, however dissatisfied with the government of their country, seldom have it in their power to transport themselves to another. It is also to be observed upon the system of acquiescence that it is in little agreement with the established opinions and practices of mankind. Thus, what has been called the law of nations lays least stress upon the allegiance of a foreigner settling among us, though his acquiescence is certainly most complete, while natives removing into an uninhabited region are claimed by the mother country, and removing into a neighboring territory are punished by municipal law, if they take arms against the country in which they were born. But surely acquiescence can scarcely be construed into consent, while the individuals concerned are wholly unapprised of the authority intended to be rested upon it. Locke, the great champion of the doctrine of an original contract, has been aware of this difficulty, and therefore observes that, quote, a tacit consent indeed obliges a man to obey the laws of any government, as long as he has any possessions or enjoyment of any part of the dominions of that government. But nothing can make a man a member of the Commonwealth, but his actually entering into it by positive engagement, and express promise and compact, end quote. A singular distinction, implying upon the face of it that an acquiescence such as has just been described is sufficient to render a man amenable to the penal regulations of society, but that his own consent is necessary to entitle him to the privileges of a citizen. A third objection to the social contract will suggest itself as soon as we attempt to ascertain the extent of the obligation, even supposing it to have been entered into in the most solemn manner by every member of the community. Allowing that I am called upon at the period of my coming of age, for example, to declare my assent or dissent to any system of opinions, or any code of practical institutes. For how long a period does this declaration bind me? Am I precluded from better information for the whole course of my life? And if not for my whole life, why for a year, a week, or even an hour? If my deliberate judgment or my real sentiment be of no avail in the case, in what sense can it be affirmed that all lawful government is founded in consent? But the question of time is not the only difficulty. If you demand my assent to any proposition, it is necessary that the proposition should be stated simply and clearly. So numerous are the varieties of human understanding, in all cases where its independence and integrity are sufficiently preserved, that there is little chance of any two men coming to a precise agreement about 10 successive propositions that are in their own nature open to debate. What then can be more absurd than to present to me the laws of England in 50 volumes folio, and call upon me to give an honest and uninfluenced vote upon their contents? But the social contract, considered as the foundation of civil government, requires of me more than this. I am not only obliged to consent to all the laws that are actually upon record, but to all the laws that shall hereafter be made. It was under this view of the subject that Rousseau, in tracing the consequences of the social contract, was led to assert that, quote, the great body of the people in whom the sovereign authority resides can neither delegate nor resign it. The essence of that authority, he adds, is the general will, and will cannot be represented. It must either be the same or another. There is no alternative. The deputies of the people cannot be its representatives. They are merely its attorneys. The laws which the community does not ratify in person are no laws, are nullities. End quote. The difficulty here stated has been endeavored to be provided against by some late advocates for liberty in the way of addresses of adhesion, addresses originating in the various districts and departments of a nation, and without which no regulation of constitutional importance is to be deemed valid. But this is a very superficial remedy. The addressers, of course, have seldom any other alternative than that above alluded to, of indiscriminate admission or rejection. There is an infinite difference between the first deliberation and the subsequent exercise of a negative. The former is a real power, the latter is seldom more than the shadow of a power. Not to add that addresses are a most precarious and equivocal mode of collecting the sense of a nation. Oh, addresses, not addresses. Not to add, maybe that was a typo. Note to add that addresses are a most precarious and equivocal mode of collecting the sense of a nation. They are usually voted in a tumultuous and summary manner. They are carried along by the tide of party, and the signatures annexed to them are obtained by indirect and accidental methods, while multitudes of bystanders, unless upon some extraordinary occasion, remain ignorant of or indifferent to the transaction. Lastly, if government be founded in the consent of the people, it can have no power over any individual by whom that consent is refused. If a tacit consent be not sufficient, still less can I be deemed to have consented to a measure upon which I put an express negative. This immediately follows from the observations of Rousseau. If the people, or the individuals of whom the people is constituted, cannot delegate their authority to a representative, neither can any individual delegate his authority to a majority, in an assembly of which he is himself a member. That must surely be a singular species of consent, the external indications of which are often to be found in an unremitting opposition in the first instance, and compulsory subjection in the second. Whew. That was like reading an SAT test. Oh, we got a Helen in with the dictionary in chat. What's up, Helen? Yes, the U.S. Constitution is a social contract that is invalid because no one alive has agreed to it or signed it. Nice. All right, moving on. Chapter 3, Max Stirner, from The Ego and His Own in 1844. Again, beginning with Michael Malice's paragraph. Somewhat of a hipster precursor to Nietzsche, you probably haven't heard of him. Max Stirner's idiosyncratic book Der Einzig and sein Agentum, sorry, I'm terrible at that language, was supposedly regarded as too crazy to bother censoring. Stirner died largely forgotten, with the only images left behind of him being a couple of drawings by Marx's comrade-in-arms, Friedrich Engels. His unique, energetic text later inspired egoists and anarchists alike, though not Nietzsche, who apparently never read him, with the opening salvo of, quote, "All things are nothing to me," being a cry of proud rebellion. Stirner's reduction of a purportedly morally binding concept such as a duty to mere, quote, "spooks," continues to resonate with anarchists today. Helen, the word wrong is not a counterargument. My power. Now we're moving on to Stirner's actual writing. My power. Right is the spirit of society. If society has a will, this will is simply right. Society exists only through right, but as it endures only exercising a sovereignty over individuals, right is its sovereign will. Aristotle says justice is the advantage of society. Society is a collective concept. It is a term that stands in place of saying a group of humans working together. Groups of humans do not share a will. This is me talking. Groups of humans do not share a will, so you cannot say that society has a will. This is something that you've heard me talk about often. This is collectivizing language right out of the gate. Moving on. All existing right is foreign law. Someone makes me out to be in the right, quote, does right by me. But should I therefore be in the right if all the world made me out so? And yet what else is the right that I obtain in the state, in society, but a right of those foreign to me? When a blockhead makes me out in the right, I grow distrustful of my rightness. I don't like to receive it from him, but even when a wise man makes me out in the right, I nevertheless am not in the right on that account. Whether I am in the right is completely independent of the fool's making out and of the wise man's. Excuse me 1 second. Helen is quoting the oath of commissioned officers when you join the army. I did not join the army. I did not take such an oath, and if I did, I would have withdrawn my consent, making the Constitution null and void on me. What's up, Outlaw Barber? Good to see you. Yeah, this is happening. Well, right now I'm reading Max Stirner, which, outside the context of Michael Malice's book, not something I probably would have published on this channel, but it'll be good for commentary. Okay, back to the book. All the same, we have coveted this right until now. We seek for right and turn to the court for that purpose. To what? To a royal, a papal, a popular court, etc.? Can a sultanic court declare another right than that which the sultan has ordained to be right? Can it make me out in the right if I seek for a right that does not agree with the sultan's law? Can it, for instance, concede to me high treason as a right, since it is assuredly not a right according to the sultan's mind? Can it, as a court of censorship, allow me the free utterance of opinion as a right, since the sultan will hear nothing of this my right? What am I seeking for in this court, then? I am seeking for sultanic right, not my right. I am seeking for foreign right. As long as this foreign right harmonizes with mine, to be sure I shall find it in the latter too. The state does not permit pitching into each other man to man. It opposes the duel. Even every ordinary appeal to blows, notwithstanding that neither of the fighters calls the police to it, is punished, except when it is not an eye whacking away at you, but, say, the head of a family at the child. The family is entitled to this, and in its name the father. I, as ego, am not. The Vossische Zeitung presents to us the, quote, commonwealth of right. There everything is to be decided by the judge and a court. It ranks the Supreme Court of censorship as a, quote, court where, quote, right is declared. What sort of a right? The right of the censorship. To recognize the sentences of that court as right, one must regard the censorship as right. But it is thought, nevertheless, that this court offers a protection. Yes, protection against an individual's censor's error. It protects only the censorship legislator against false interpretation of his will, at the same time making his statute by the, quote, sacred power of right, all the firmer against writers. Helen says, your lack of consent does not negate the consent of others. You are more than welcome to consent to the Constitution in whatever terrible, despicable, shambles state it is in right now. But what you consent to has no rightful effect or binding effect on my life and what I do and my interactions and my property. So as long as we're clear on that, we good. And if you'd like to come on the show and talk through it, I'm more than happy to have that conversation, but I'm going to focus on this book for now. And please, if you'd like to have the conversation, reach out to me and we can pick it up from there. I don't want to keep jumping off the topic of the book to have this conversation. Hey, good to see you guys over on Odysee. Hope the stream is doing better there. It's been having trouble lately. Okay, back to the book. Whether I am in the right or not, there is no judge but myself. Others can judge only whether they endorse my right and whether it exists as right for them too. In the meantime, let us take the matter yet another way. I am to reverence sultanic law in the sultanate, popular law in republics, canon law in Catholic communities. To these laws I am to subordinate myself. I am to regard them as sacred. A, quote, sense of right and, quote, law-abiding mind of such a sort is so firmly planted in people's heads that the most revolutionary persons of our days want to subject us to a new sacred law, the law of society, the law of mankind, the right of all, and the like. The right of all is to go before my right. As a right of all, it would indeed be my right among the rest, since I, with the rest, am included in all, but that it is at the same time a right of others, or even of all others, does not move me to its upholding. Not as a right of all will I defend it, but as my right. And then every other may see to it how he shall likewise maintain it for himself. The right of all, for example, to eat, is a right of every individual. False. To say that you have a right to eat is to say that you have the right to anything that you need to eat, which in a lot of circumstances would include stealing, enslaving others, taking from them what they need to eat. There is no such thing as a positive right in this sentence, at least not with without positive action to take on the obligation. Yeah, Stephen, the old language is it's difficult to read too. I hope I'm doing a decent job. Blake says the Stirner chapter you're presently reading is my least favorite in the entire book. None of it makes any sense. It is difficult. I mean, he's making some decent points, but it's not terribly clear. But the social reformers preach to us a, quote, law of society. There, the individual becomes society's slave, and is in the right only when society makes him out in the right, when he lives according to society's statutes, and so it is loyal. Whether I am loyal under a despotism or in a society, a la Wetling, it is the same absence of right insofar as in both cases I have not my right, but foreign right. In consideration of right, the question is always asked, quote, what or who gives me the right to it? Answer, God, love, reason, nature, humanity, etc. No, only your might, your power gives you the right. Your reason, therefore, may give it to you. I think he literally just said might makes right, which is the absence of morality, which erases the concept of right from existence. I hope it's easy to tell when I stop reading and start talking, because I would hate for you to think my words were in the book. Communism, which assumes that men have quote, have equal rights by nature, contradicts its own proposition until it comes to this, that men have no right at all by nature, for it is not willing to recognize, for instance, that parents have, quote, by nature, rights as against their children, or the children as against the parents. It abolishes the family. Nature gives parents, brothers, and so on, no right at all. Altogether, this entire revolutionary or Balboist principle rests on a religious, that is, false, view of things. Who can ask after right if he does not occupy the religious standpoint himself? Is not right a religious concept, something sacred? Why, equality of rights, as the revolution propounded it, is only another name for Christian equality, the equality of the brethren, of God's children, of Christians, in short, fraternity. Each and every inquiry after right deserves to be lashed with Schiller's words, quote, many a year I've used my nose to smell the onion and the rose. Is there any proof which shows that I've a right to that same nose? When the revolution stamped equality as a, quote, right, it took flight into the religious domain, into the region of the sacred, of the ideal. Hence, since then, the fight for the sacred and alienable rights of man. Against the eternal rights of man and the, quote, well-earned rights of the established order, are quite naturally, and with equal right brought to bear, right against right, where of course one is decried by the other as wrong. This has been the contest of rights since the Revolution. That could have definitely been composed more clearly. Helen says, people who agree on what constitutes a right join together to protect what they believe to be rights. I agree. Outlaw says, might makes right in the mind of a communist because it, quote, it is for the greater good. They will always justify this until they are the one told to face the wall. You want to be, quote, in the right as against the rest. That you cannot as against them you remain forever in the wrong, for they surely would not be your opponents if they were not in their right to. They will always make you out in the wrong. But as against the right of the rest, yours is higher, greater, more powerful right, is it not? I would have to read that 7 more times to understand what he meant. No such thing, he says. Back to the book. No such thing. Your right is not more powerful if you are not more powerful. Have Chinese subjects a right to freedom? Just bestow it on them and then look how far you have gone wrong in your attempt. Because they do not know how to use freedom, they have no right to it, or in clearer terms, because they have not freedom, they have not the right to it. What? Children have no right to the condition of majority because they are not of age, because they are children. Peoples that let themselves be kept in nonage have no rights to the condition of majority. If they ceased to be in nonage, then only would they have the right to be of age. This means nothing else than, quote, what you have the power to be, you have the right to. I derive all right and warrant from me. I am entitled to everything I have in my power. I am entitled to overthrow Zeus, Jehovah, God, if I can. If I cannot, then these gods will always remain in the right and in power as against me. And what I do will be to fear their right and their power in impotent God-fearingness. It's a long sentence. Let me pick it up in the middle at the semicolon. If I cannot, then these gods will always remain in the right and in power as against me, and what I do will be to fear their right and their power in impotent God-fearingness, to keep their commandments, and believe that I do right in everything that I do according to their right, about as the Russian boundary sentinels think themselves rightfully entitled to shoot dead the suspicious persons who are escaping, since they murder by superior authority with right. I want to point out that that was half of the sentence. Whew, that was a 3-lungful sentence. But I am entitled by myself to murder if I myself do not forbid it to myself, if I myself do not fear murder as a wrong. This view of things lies at the foundation of Chamiso's poem Das Mortal, where the gray-haired Indian murderer compels reverence from the white man whose brethren he has murdered. The only thing I am not entitled to is what I do not do with a free cheer, that is, what I do not entitle myself to. I decide whether it is the right thing in me. There is no right outside me. If it is right for me, it is right. Possibly this may not suffice to make it right for the rest. That is their care, not mine. Let them defend themselves. This guy's an asshole. And if for the whole world something were not right, but it were right for me, that is, I wanted it, then I would ask nothing about the whole world. So everyone does who knows how to value himself, everyone in the degree that he is an egoist. For might goes before right, and that with perfect right. This is the absence of moral philosophy. Yes, Stephen, literal red flags everywhere, because it's actually red. Because I am, quote, by nature a man, I have an equal right to the enjoyment of all goods, says Baboof? I don't know how to say that. Must he not also say, because I am, quote, by nature, a firstborn prince, I have a right to the throne? The rights of man and the, quote, well-earned rights come to the same thing in the end, to wit, to nature, which gives me a right, that is, to birth, and further inheritance. Quote, I am born as a man, is equal to, quote, I am born as a king's son. The natural man has only a natural right because he has only a natural power and natural claims. He has a right of birth and claims of birth. But nature cannot entitle me, give me capacity or might to that to which only my act entitles me. That the king's child sets himself above other children, even this is his act which secures to him the precedence. And that the other children approve and recognize this act is their act, which makes them worthy to be subjects. Whether nature gives me a right or whether God, the people's choice, etc., does so, all of that is the same foreign right, a right that I do not give or take to myself. Thus, the communists say, equal labor entitles a man to equal enjoyment. Formerly, the question was raised whether the, quote, virtuous man must not be happy on earth. The Jews actually drew this inference, quote, that it may go well with thee on earth. No equal labor does not entitle you to it, but equal enjoyment alone entitles you to equal enjoyment. Enjoy, then you are entitled to enjoyment. But if you have labored and let the enjoyment be taken from you, then, quote, it serves you right. Yes, this guy is an asshole. Wasn't in the book. Yeah, that's true. Woo! I'm gonna have a little sip of coffee before I continue with this mess. If you take the enjoyment, it is your right. If, on the contrary, you only pine for it without laying hands on it, it remains as before, a well-earned right of those who are privileged for enjoyment. It is their right, as by laying hands on it would become your right. The conflict over the, quote, right of property wavers in vehement commotion. The communists affirm that, quote, the earth belongs rightfully to him who tills it, and its products to whom bring them out. I think it belongs to him who knows how to take it, or who does not let it be taken from him, does not let himself be deprived of it. If he appropriates it, then not only the earth, but the right to it too belongs to him. This is egoistic right. It is right for me, therefore it is right. Yeah, this is just the absence of moral philosophy. This is just might makes right, which is not a moral philosophy. It's like just a state of nature. The lion takes his meals by tooth and fang. Aside from this, right? Like, how would a person espousing this belief look at you and say that they don't want you to attack them to take what you want? Well, they probably wouldn't. These are people that deserve and are basically expecting you to treat them the same way as a dangerous animal. Terrible, shitty way to live. Whew. Aside from this, right does have, quote, a wax nose. The tiger that assails me is in the right, and I who strike him down am also in the right. I defend against him, not my right, but myself. The usage of the word right in describing a state of nature is just a mess. This is a mess. As human right is always something given, it always in reality reduces to the right which men concede to each other. If the right to existence is conceded to newborn children, then they have the right. If it is not conceded to them, as was the case among the Spartans and ancient Romans, then they do not have it. For only society can give or concede it to them. They themselves cannot take it or give it to themselves. It will be objected, the children had nevertheless by nature the right to exist. Only the Spartans refused recognition to this right. But then they simply had no right to this recognition, no more than they had to recognition of their life by the wild beasts to which they were thrown. Quote, people talk so much about birthright and complain. There is, alas, no mention of the rights that were born with us." End quote. What sort of right, then, is there that was born with me? The right to receive an entailed estate, to inherit a throne, to enjoy a princely or noble education, or again, because poor parents begot me, to get free schooling, be clothed out of contributions of alms, and at least earn my bread and my herring in the coal mines or at the loom? Are these not birthrights, rights that have come down to me from my parents through birth? You think, no, you think these are only rights improperly so called. It is just these rights that you aim to abolish through the real birthright. To give a basis for this, you go back to the simplest thing and affirm that everyone is by birth equal to another, to wit, a man. I will grant you that everyone is born as a man, hence, the newborn are therein equal to each other. Why are they? Only because they do not yet show and exert themselves as anything but bare children of men, naked little human beings. But thereby they are at once different from those who have already made something out of themselves, who thus are no longer bare children of man, but children of their own creation. The latter possesses more than bare birthrights. They have earned rights. What an antithesis, what a field of combat! The old combat of the birthrights of man and well-earned rights. Go right on appealing to your birthrights. People will not fail to oppose to you the well-earned. Both stand on the, quote, ground of right, for each of the two has a right against the other. The one the birthright of natural right, the other the earned or well-earned right. If you remain on the ground of right, you remain in recthaberi, maybe, is how you say that. The other cannot give you your right. He cannot, quote, mete out right to you. He who has might has right. If you have not the former, neither have you the latter. Is this wisdom so hard to attain? Just look at the mighty and their doings. We are talking here only of China and Japan, of course. Just try it once, you Chinese and Japanese, to make them out in the wrong and learn by experience how they throw you into jail. Only do not confuse with this the well-meaning counsels which in China and Japan are permitted, because they do not hinder the mighty one, but possibly help him on. For him who should want to make them out in the wrong, there would stand open only one way thereto, that of might. If he deprives them of their might, then he has really made them out in the wrong. Deprive them of their right. In any other case, he can do nothing but clench his little fist in his pocket, or fall a victim as an obtrusive fool. Whew! In short. Man, this is not in short. There's nothing in short about this. Oh my God, it goes on for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages. Oof. We can do this. In short, if you Chinese or Japanese did not ask after right, and in particular if you did not ask after the rights, quote, that were born with you, then you would not need to ask at all after the well-earned rights either. You start back in fright before others because you think you see beside them the ghost of right, which, as in the Homeric combats, seem to fight as a goddess at their side helping them. What do? Do you throw the spear? No, you creep around to gain the spook over to yourselves, that it may fight on your side. You woo for the ghost's favor. Another would simply ask thus, do I will what my opponent wills? No. Now then, there may fight for him 1,000 devils or gods, I go at him all the same. The Commonwealth of Right, as the Vossich, I don't know how to say these words, among others, stands for it, asks that office holders be removable only by the judge, not by the administration. Vain illusion! If it were settled by law that an office holder who is once seen drunken shall lose his office, then the judges would have to condemn him on the word of the witnesses. In short, the lawgiver would only have to state precisely all the possible grounds which entail the loss of office, however laughable they might be. That is, he who laughs in his superiors' faces, who does not go to church every Sunday, who does not take the communion every 4 weeks, who runs in debt, who has disreputable associates, who shows no determination, etc., shall be removed. These things the lawgiver might take it into his head to prescribe for a court of honor. Then the judge would solely have to investigate whether the accused had, quote, become guilty of those offenses, and, on presentation of the proof, pronounce sentence of removal against him, quote, in the name of the law. The judge is lost when he ceases to be mechanical. When he is forsaken by the rules of evidence, then he no longer has anything but an opinion like everybody else. And if he decides according to this opinion, his action is no longer an official action. As judge, he must decide only according to the law. Commend me rather to the old French parliaments, which wanted to examine for themselves what was to be matters of right, and to register it only after their own approval. They at least judged according to a right of their own, and were not willing to give themselves up to be machines of the lawgiver, although as judges they must, to be sure, become their own machines. It is said that punishment is the criminal's right, but impunity is just as much his right. If his undertaking succeeds, it serves him right, and if it does not succeed, it likewise serves him right. You make your bed and lie in it. If someone goes foolhardily into dangers and perishes in them, we are apt to say, quote, it serves him right, he would have it so. But if he conquered the dangers, if his might was victorious, then he would be in the right too. If a child plays with a knife and gets cut, it is served right. But if it doesn't get cut, it is served right too. Hence, right befalls the criminal, doubtless, when he suffers what he risked. Why, what did he risk it for, since he knew the possible consequences? But the punishment that we decree against him is only our right, not his. Our right reacts against his, and he is in the wrong at last because we get the upper hand. I don't know how many more times I can stand him saying the same thing in a different way with weird words. Yeah. I'm sorry, guys. I'm skipping this. I'm going to scan forward and see if he ever talks about something new. If you want to read this, you're welcome to buy the book. There's a link in the description. This is a waste of time. I'm just scanning forward. Bear with me. I'm saving us all time, I promise. Okay. I'll read the last section and then we'll move on to the next chapter. Now, in conclusion, I have still to take back the halfway form of expression of which I was willing to make use only so long as I was still rooting among the entrails of right, and letting the word at least stand. But, in fact, with the concept the word too loses its meaning. What I called my right is no longer right at all, because right can be bestowed only by a spirit, be it in the spirit of nature, or that of the species of mankind, the spirit of God, or that of his holiness or his highness, etc. What I have without an entitling spirit, I have without right. I have it solely and alone through my power. I do not demand any right, therefore I need not recognize any either. What I can get by force, I get by force, and what I do not get by force, I have no right to, nor do I give myself airs or consolation with my imprescriptible right. With absolute right, right itself passes away. The dominion of the concept of right is cancelled at the same time. This is kind of what I said earlier. What he's describing is not right and wrong. It's just a state of nature. Those concepts don't exist there. He's just describing state of nature and then talking about it as if it's a good idea to want to associate with people on those terms. 4. For it is not to be forgotten that hitherto concepts, ideas, or principles ruled us, and that among these rulers the concept of right or of justice played one of the most important parts. Yes, the human superpower, the thing that makes it possible for us to elevate ourselves out of the state of nature, is to hold concepts above ourselves. Entitled or unentitled, that does not concern me. If I am only powerful, I am myself empowered, and need no other empowering or entitling. Right is a wheel in the head, put there by a spook. Power, that I am myself. I am the powerful one, and owner of power. Right is above me, is absolute, and exists in one higher, as whose grace it flows to me. Right is a gift of grace from the judge. Power and might exist only in me, and powerful and mighty. Oh, okay. I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to take one little moment here. We're going to take a little break. After that. Woo! How y'all doing? Helen says she's seen Stirner quotes on Party Libertarians' pages. Yeah, there's a lot of confused people calling themselves libertarians. For sure. Keith Knight says the Max Stirner essay was so boring and useless. His nickname should be Nick Sarwark. What's up, man? Good to see you. Yeah, man, that was painful. I'm sorry, guys, if you wanted me to read the whole thing. That was just repetitive. Woo. Okay, moving on. Chapter 4. Pierre Joseph Proudhon, from The Confessions of a Revolutionist, 1850. Intro by Michael Malice. Proudhon can be regarded as the first modern intellectual to refer to himself as an anarchist, and he is the source for much of what followed philosophically. It was he who coined the expression property is theft. Proudhon's brand of anarchism he chose to call mutualism, which was regarded as a composite of sorts between anarchism and socialism. He would argue for a revolution that resulted in a socialist society where everyone worked voluntarily to the benefit of all. The nature and destination of government. The scriptures declare that, quote, there must be divisions, i.e. parties, among men, and the priest exclaims, quote, terrible necessity, arising from the original sin. But a little reflection has shown us the origin and signification of parties. We have now to learn their object and final destiny. All men are born free and equal. Society is therefore by nature self-governing, i.e., ungovernable. And he who lays his hand on me to govern me is a usurper and tyrant, my declared enemy. But this idea of equality did not appear in the earliest phases of society. When men met together, the first thing they agreed to was to appoint a ruler. Constitutamus super nos regem, someone in authority. Such, then, was the first idea of human society, and the next was immediately to overthrow this society, each wishing to use it for his own liberty against that of others. All parties have been eager for the possession of power, to work their own ends, hence the aphorism of the radicals to which the absolutists would willingly subscribe. Social revolution is the end. Political revolution, i.e. the transference of authority, is the means, which simply means, give us power of life and death over your persons and property, and we will make you free. What kings and priests have repeated for 6,000 years. So that government and party are reciprocally to each other cause, end, and means, beginning, middle, and end, and thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that, has been the sole education of man by governments from the time of Adam and Eve. But when mankind shall have arrived at years of discretion, parties and governments will disappear. Thus liberty will grow out of authority, as we have seen socialism result from absolutism. Philosophy therefore shows us that the establishment of authority over a people can be but a transition state and must continually diminish. Diminish? I think that's a typo. And must continually, I'm going to assume, diminish until it is swallowed up in industrial organization. The aphorism therefore must be read inversely. Political revolution, that is, the abolition of authority among men, is the end. Social revolution is the means. There can be no liberty for citizens, order for society, or union among producers until there be no more parties, no more authority, absolute liberty of the individual and the citizen. In these 3 sentences I have made my profession of faith, political and social. M.D. Giardin says, he is a revolutionist per en bout, from above, and never will be a revolutionist par en bas, from below. Now he thinks he has said something very original and profound in these expressions par en bout, par en bas, which are nothing more than the old idea of the demagogues. By the former he means evidently the government, and calls it revolutionizing by instruction, intelligence, progress, and the extension of ideas. By the latter he means the people, and terms it revolutionizing by insurrection and despair. But the country is the truth, but the contrary is the truth. For let us examine which of the 2 is the most intelligent, progressive, and peaceful, that by the government or that by the people. The former is manifestly revolutionizing according to the pleasure of the prince. The impulses of an assembly, the violence of a club, the whim of a dictator or despot. Louis XIV, Napoleon, Charles X, and practiced it after this manner, and Guizot, Louis Blanc, Leon Fauché wished to try the same mode. The other way, however, by the people is revolutionizing by the common consent of all citizens, by the experience of the laborer, by the progress and diffusion of knowledge. It is the freedom of revolution, such as Condorcet, Turgot, and Robespierre desired. The greatest revolutionist in France was Saint Louis, when he was only the register of the public will. The socialists have fallen into the same error as the radicals. Saint-Simon, Fourier, Owen, Cabet, Louis Blanc, are all for an organization of labor by means of the state or by capital or by some other form of authority. Instead of teaching the people to organize themselves and to appeal to their own reason and experience, they say, "Give us power." They are utopians like the despots. Governments, from their very nature, never can be revolutionary. Society, the whole mass of the people elevated in intelligence, can alone revolutionize itself. Governments are the scourges of God to discipline the world. For them to create liberty would be to destroy themselves. Every revolution in the world, from the crowning of the first king down to the declarations of the rights of man, has been accomplished by the spontaneous will of the people. Did government possess the science of revolution and social progress, they could not Did government possess the science of revolution and social progress, they could not apply it? Seems like there's some punctuation or something missing there. They must first transfer it to the people, and then gain their consent, which would be a contradiction in terms, and a complete misconception of the meaning of power and authority. Look at the countries that are the freest. Are they not those where the power of the government is the most restricted? Where the people generally take the initiative? The United States of America, for instance. England, Switzerland, Holland, and those are the most enslaved, where the governing power is the best organized and the strongest. Ourselves, for example. And yet we are always complaining of not being governed and asking for a stronger arm at the helm of state. The church, like an affectionate mother, came first and said, quote, "Everything for the people, but all by the prince." Yes, Stephen, what public will is right? Public is another one of those collective terms. The public does not have a will. Then came the monarchy, quote, "Everything for the people, but all by the prince." Next, the doctrinaires or liberals, quote, "Everything for the people, but all by the middle class." The radicals, though changing the formula, have retained the principle, quote, "Everything for the people, but all by the government." Always the same communism, the same governmentalism. Who then will say, everything for the people and everything by the people, even the government? According to M. Lamartine, the government has to issue its commands and the country only to yield its consent, whereas all history tells us that the government is the best which comes nearest to making itself useless. Do we want parasites to labor or priests to speak to God? Neither do we want representatives to govern us. It has been said by someone that for man to speculate in his fellow man is open robbery, and the government of man by man is slavery. So every religion founded upon any form whatever of papal infallibility is sheer idolatry, the worship of man by man. And yet, after all these fruits of the absolutist principle, we have still the judgment of man by man, the condemnation of man by man, and to crown the list, the punishment of man by man. All these, however, we must submit to, until in the progress of time they grow old, perish, and fall off, like ripe fruits in their due season. They are the instruments of our apprenticeship. Philosophy repudiates these symbols of a barbarous age, and yet admits not the rights of any one to compel a people to be free, who wish to be governed. It has no confidence in any social reforms that do not arise spontaneously from the people, and acknowledge no revolutions that do not receive the initiative from the masses. Oof, okay. Let's see what's next. Chapter 5. Herbert Spencer, from Social Statics, 1851. Here's Michael Malice's introduction. Though largely forgotten today, Herbert Spencer was one of the preeminent British intellectuals of the latter half of the 19th century. It was he and not Darwin who coined the term survival of the fittest, by which he meant that in any environment the fittest will survive, not necessarily that they should. Decades later, Murray Rothbard reportedly called Social Statics, quote, the greatest single work of libertarian political philosophy ever written. Yet, Spencer was no anarchist, and had the following chapter quietly removed from Social Statics when it was republished years later. Anarchists later found the excised chapter and republished it far and wide after his death. Interesting. The right to ignore the state. 1. As a corollary to the proposition that all institutions must be subordinated to the law of equal freedom, we cannot choose but admit the right of the citizen to adopt a condition of voluntary outlawry. If every man has freedom to do all that he wills, provided he infringes not the equal freedom of any other man, then he is free to drop connection with the state, to relinquish its protection, and to refuse paying towards its support. It is self-evident that in so behaving he in no way trenches upon the liberty of others, for his position is a passive one, and whilst passive he cannot become an aggressor. Hear, hear. Well said. It is equally self-evident that he cannot be compelled to continue one of a political corporation without a breach of the moral law. Seeing that citizenship involves payment of taxes, and the taking away of a man's property against his will is an infringement of his rights. Government being simply an agent employed in common by a number of individuals to secure to them certain advantages, the very nature of the connection implies that it is for each to say whether he will employ such an agent or not. If any one of them determines to ignore this mutual safety confederation, nothing can be said except that he loses all claim to its good offices, and exposes himself to the danger of maltreatment, a thing he is quite at liberty to do if he likes. He cannot be coerced into political combination without a breach of the law of equal freedom. He can withdraw from it without committing any such breach, and he has therefore a right so to withdraw. 2. Quote, no human laws are of any validity if contrary to the law of nature, and such of them as are valid derive all their force and all their authority mediately or immediately from this original. End quote. Thus writes Blackstone, to whom let all honor be given for having so far outseen the ideas of his time, and indeed we may say of our time. A good antidote, this, for those political superstitions which so widely prevail. A good check upon that sentiment of power worship, which still misleads us by magnifying the prerogatives of constitutional governments as it once did those of monarchs. Let men learn that a legislature is not, quote, our God upon earth, though by the authority they ascribe to it and the things they expect from it, they would seem to think it is. Let them learn rather that it is an institution serving a purely temporary purpose, whose power, when not stolen, is at the best borrowed. Nay, indeed, have we not seen that government is essentially immoral? Is it not the offspring of evil, bearing about it all the marks of its parentage? Does it not exist because crime exists? Is it not strong, or, as we say, despotic, when crime is great? Is there not more liberty, that is, less government, as crime diminishes? And must not government cease when crime ceases? For very lack of objects on which to perform its function. Not only does magisterial power exist because of evil, but it exists by evil. Violence is employed to maintain it, and all violence involves criminality. Soldiers, policemen, and gaolers? Swords, batons, and fetters are instruments for inflicting pain, and all infliction of pain is, in the abstract, wrong. The state employs evil weapons to subjugate evil, and is alike contaminated by the objects with which it deals and the means by which it works. Morality cannot recognize it, for morality, being simply a statement of the perfect law, can give no countenance to anything growing out of and living by breaches of that law. Wherefore legislative authority can never be ethical, must always be conventional merely. Hence there is a certain inconsistency in the attempt to determine the right position, structure, and conduct of a government by appeal to the first principles of rectitude. For, as just pointed out, the acts of an institution which is in both nature and origin imperfect cannot be made to square with the perfect law. All that we can do is to ascertain, firstly, in what attitude a legislature must stand to the community, to avoid being by its mere existence an embodied wrong. Secondly, in what manner it must be constituted so as to exhibit the least incongruity with the moral law. And, thirdly, to what sphere its actions must be limited to prevent it from multiplying those breaches of equity it is set up to prevent. The first condition to be conformed to before a legislature can be established without violating the law of equal freedom is the acknowledgement of the right now under discussion, the right to ignore the state. I was just thinking about a couple paragraphs back. Does the state not exist because crime exists? Is it not strong, or as we say, despotic, when crime is great? Is there not more liberty, that is, less government, as crime diminishes? And must not government cease when crime ceases, for the very lack of objects on which to perform its function? Not only does magisterial power exist because of evil, but it exists by evil. Yeah, man. Interesting. Said in a way I've never heard before. That was neat. Okay. Number 3. Upholders of pure despotism may fitly believe state control to be unlimited and unconditional. They who assert that men are made for governments and not governments for men may consistently hold that no one can remove himself beyond the pale of political organization. But they who maintain that the people are the only legitimate source of power, that legislative authority is not original but deputed, cannot deny the right to ignore the state without entangling themselves in an absurdity. For, if legislative authority is deputed, it follows that those from whom it proceeds are the masters of those on whom it is conferred. It follows further that as masters they confer the said authority voluntarily, and this implies that they may give or withhold it as they please. To call that deputed which is wrenched from men whether they will or not is nonsense. But what is here true of all collectively is equally true of each separately. As a government can rightly act for the people only when empowered by them, so also can it rightly act for the individual only when empowered by him. If A, B, and C debate whether they shall employ an agent to perform for them a certain service, and if whilst A and B agree to do so, C dissents, C cannot equitably be made a party to the agreement in spite of himself. And this must be equally true of 30 as of 3. And if of 30, why not of 300 or 3,000 or 3 millions? Number 4. Of the political superstitions lately alluded to, none is so universally diffused as the notion that majorities are omnipotent. Under the impression that the preservation of order will ever require power to be wielded by some party, the moral sense of our time feels that such power cannot rightly be conferred on any but the largest moiety of society. It interprets literally the saying that, quote, "the voice of the people is the voice of God." And transferring to the one the sacredness attached to the other, it concludes that from the will of the people, that is, of the majority, there can be no appeal. Yet is this belief entirely erroneous. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that, struck by some Malthusian panic, a legislature duly representing public opinion were to enact that all children born during the next 10 years should be drowned. Does anyone think such an enactment would be warrantable? If not, there is evidently a limit to the power of a majority. Suppose again that of two races living together, the Celts and Saxons, for example, Celts and Saxons, for example, the most numerous determined to make the others their slaves. Would the authority of the greatest number be in such case valid? If not, there is something to which its authority must be subordinate. Suppose once more that all men having incomes under £50 a year were to resolve upon reducing every income above that amount to their own standard, and appropriating the excess for public purposes. Could their resolution be justified? If not, it must be a third time confessed that there is a law to which the popular voice must defer. What then is that law, if not the law of pure equity, the law of equal freedom? These restraints, which all would put to the will of the majority, are exactly the restraints set up by that law. We deny the right of a majority to murder, to enslave, or to rob, simply because murder, enslaving, and robbery are violations of that law, violations too gross to be overlooked. But if great violations of it are wrong, so also are smaller ones. If the will of the many cannot supersede the first principle of morality in these cases, neither can it in any. So that, however insignificant the minority, and however trifling the proposed trespass against their rights, no such trespass is permissible. When we have made our Constitution purely democratic, thinks to himself the earnest reformer, we shall have brought government into harmony with absolute justice. Such a faith, though perhaps needful for the age, is a very erroneous one. By no process can coercion be made equitable. The freest form of government is only the least objectionable form. The rule of the many by the few we call tyranny. The rule of the few by the many is tyranny also, only of a less intense kind. Quote, "You shall do as we will and not as you will," is in either case the declaration, and if the 100 make it to 99 instead of the 99 to the 100, it is only a fraction less immoral. Of two such parties, whichever fulfills this declaration necessarily breaks the law of equal freedom, the only difference being that by the one it is broken in the persons of 99, whilst by the other it is broken in the persons of 100. And the merit of the democratic form of government consists solely in this, that it trespasses against the smallest number. The very existence of majorities and minorities is indicative of an immoral state. The man whose character harmonizes with the moral law, we found to be one who can obtain complete happiness without diminishing the happiness of his fellows. But the enactment of public arrangements by vote implies a society consisting of men otherwise constituted, implies that the desires of some cannot be satisfied without sacrificing the desires of others, implies that in the pursuit of their happiness, the majority inflict a certain amount of unhappiness on the minority. Implies, therefore, organic immorality. Thus, from another point of view, we again perceive that even in its most equitable form, it is impossible for government to dissociate itself from evil. And further, that unless the right to ignore the state is recognized, its acts must be essentially criminal. Whew, well said. I like that last paragraph. Number 5. That a man is free to abandon the benefits and throw off the burdens of citizenship may indeed be inferred from the admissions of existing authorities and of current opinion. Unprepared as they probably are for so extreme a doctrine as the one here maintained, the radicals of our day yet unwittingly profess their belief in a maxim which obviously embodies this doctrine. Do we not continually hear them quote Blackstone's assertion that, quote, no subject of England can be constrained to pay any aids or taxes even for the defense of the realm or the support of government, but such as are imposed by his own consent, or that of his representative in Parliament? And what does this mean? It means, say they, that every man should have a vote. True, but it means much more. If there is any sense in words, it is a distinct enunciation of the very right now contended for, in affirming that a man may not be taxed unless he has directly or indirectly given his consent. It affirms that he may refuse to be so taxed, and to refuse to be taxed is to cut all connection with the state. Perhaps it will be said that this consent is not a specific, but a general one, and that the citizen is understood to have assented to everything his representative may do when he voted for him. But suppose he did not vote for him, and on the contrary, did all in his power to get elected someone holding opposite views, what then? The reply will probably be that by taking part in such an election, he tacitly agreed to abide by the decision of the majority. And how if he did not vote at all? Why then, he cannot justly complain of any tax, seeing that he made no protest against its imposition. So, curiously enough, it seems that he gave his consent in whatever way he acted, whether he said yes, whether he said no, or whether he remained neuter. A rather awkward doctrine, this. That's funny. A rather awkward doctrine, this. Here stands an unfortunate citizen who is asked if he will pay money for a certain proffered advantage, and whether he employs the only means of expressing his refusal or does not employ it, we are told that he practically agrees, if only the number of others who agree is greater than the number of those who dissent. And thus we are introduced to the novel principle that A's consent to a thing is not determined by what A says, but by what B may happen to say. It's so clear. It's hilarious when you think about it, when you back up and describe it clearly. It's hilariously clear. A rather awkward doctrine, this. Oh man, that's great. It is for those who quote Blackstone to choose between this absurdity and the doctrine above set forth. Either this maxim applies the right to ignore the state, or it is sheer nonsense. Whew. Number 6. There is a strange heterogeneity in our political faiths. Systems that have had their day and are beginning here and there to let the daylight through are patched with modern notions utterly unlike in quality and color, and men gravely display these systems, wear them, and walk about in them, quite unconscious of their grotesqueness. This transition state of ours, partaking as it does equally of the past and the future, breeds hybrid theories exhibiting the oddest union of bygone despotism and coming freedom. Here are types of the old organization curiously disguised by germs of the new, peculiarities showing adaptation to a preceding state modified by rudiments that prophesy of something to come. Making altogether so chaotic a mixture of relationships that there is no saying to what class these births of the age should be referred. As ideas must of necessity bear the stamp of the time, it is useless to lament the contentment with which these incongruous beliefs are held. Otherwise it would seem unfortunate that men do not pursue to the end of the trains of reasoning which have led to these partial modifications. In the present case, for example, consistency would force them to admit that, on other points beside the one just noticed, they hold opinions and use arguments in which the right to ignore the state is involved. For what is the meaning of dissent? The time was when a man's faith and his mode of worship were as much determinable by law as his secular acts, and according to provisions extant in our statute book, are so still. Thanks to the growth of a Protestant spirit, however, we have ignored the state in this matter, wholly in theory and partly in practice. But how have we done so? By assuming an attitude which, if consistently maintained, implies a right to ignore the state entirely. Observe the positions of the two parties. Quote, "This is your creed," says the legislator. "You must believe and openly profess what is here set down for you." "I shall not do anything of the kind," answers the nonconformist. "I will go to prison rather." "Your religious ordinances," pursues the legislator, "shall be such as we have prescribed. You shall attend the churches we have endowed, and adopt the ceremonies used in them." "Nothing shall induce me to do so," is the reply. "I altogether deny your power to dictate to me in such matters, and mean to resist to the uttermost." Lastly, adds the legislator, "we shall require you to pay such sums of money toward the support of these religious institutions as we may see fit to ask." "Not a farthing will you have from me," exclaims our sturdy independent. "Even did I believe in the doctrines of your church, which I do not, I should still rebel against your interference, and, if you take my property, it shall be by force and under protest." What now does this proceeding amount to when regarded in the abstract? It amounts to an assertion by the individual of the right to exercise one of his faculties, the religious sentiment, without let or hindrance, and with no limit save that set up by equal claims of others. And what is meant by ignoring the state? Simply an assertion of the right similarly to exercise all the faculties. The one is just an expansion of the other, rests on the same footing with the other, must stand or fall with the other. Men do indeed speak of evil and religious liberty as different things, but the distinction is quite arbitrary. They are parts of the same whole and cannot be philosophically separated. "Yes, they can," interposes an objector. "Assertion of the one is imperative as being a religious duty. The liberty to worship God in the way that seems to him right is a liberty without which a man cannot fulfill what he believes to be divine commands, and therefore conscience requires him to maintain it." End quote. True enough. But how if the same can be asserted of all other liberty? How if maintenance of this also turns out to be a matter of conscience? Have we not seen that human happiness is the divine will, that only by exercising our faculties is this happiness obtainable, and that it is impossible to exercise them without freedom? And if this freedom for the exercise of faculties is a condition without which the divine will cannot be fulfilled, the preservation of it is, by our objector's own showing, a duty. Or, in other words, it appears not only that the maintenance of liberty of action may be a point of conscience, but that it ought to be one. And thus, we are clearly shown that the claims to ignore the state in religious and in secular matters are in essence identical. The other reason commonly assigned for nonconformity admits of similar treatment. Besides resisting state dictation in the abstract, the dissenter resists it from disapprobation of the doctrines taught. No legislative injunction will make him adopt what he considers an erroneous belief, and, bearing in mind his duty toward his fellow men, he refuses to help through the medium of his purse in disseminating this erroneous belief. The position is perfectly intelligible, but it is one which either commits its adherents to civil nonconformity also, or leaves them in a dilemma. For why do they refuse to be instrumental in spreading error? Because error is adverse to human happiness. And on what ground is any piece of secular legislation disapproved? For the same reason, because thought adverse to thought adverse to human happiness. And on what ground is any piece of secular legislation disapproved? For the same reason, because thought adverse to human happiness. Sorry, some of the grammar. How then can it be shown that the state ought to be resisted in the one case and not in the other? Will anyone deliberately assert that, if a government demands money from us to aid in teaching what we think will produce evil, we ought to refuse it? But that if the money is for the purpose of doing what we think will produce evil, we ought not to refuse it? Yet such is the hopeful proposition which those have to maintain who recognize the right to ignore the state in religious matters, but deny it in civil matters. That last sentence was a good one. Will anyone deliberately assert that, if a government demands money from us to aid in teaching what we think will produce evil, we ought to refuse it, but that if the money is for the purpose of doing what we think will produce evil, we ought not to refuse it? Yet such is the hopeful proposition which those have to maintain, who recognize the right to ignore the state in religious matters, but deny it in civil matters. Really, really good. I like that. Number 7. The substance of this chapter once more reminds us of the incongruity between a perfect law and an imperfect state. The practicability of the principle here laid down varies directly as social morality. In a thoroughly vicious community, its admission would be productive of anarchy. In a completely virtuous one, its admission will be both innocuous and inevitable. Progress toward a condition of social health, a condition that is in which the remedial measures of legislation will no longer be needed, is progress toward a condition in which those remedial measures will be cast aside and the authority prescribing them disregarded. The two changes are of necessity coordinate. That moral sense whose supremacy will make society harmonious and government unnecessary is the same moral sense which will then make each man assert his freedom even to the extent of ignoring the state, is the same moral sense which, by deterring the majority from coercing the minority, will eventually render government impossible. And, as what are merely different manifestations of the same sentiment must bear a constant ratio to each other, the tendency to repudiate governments will increase only at the same rate that governments become needless. Let not any be alarmed, therefore, at the promulgation of the foregoing doctrine. There are many changes yet to be passed through before it can begin to exercise much influence. Probably a long time will elapse before the right to ignore the state will be generally admitted, even in theory. It will be still longer before it receives legislative recognition, and even then there will be plenty of checks upon the premature exercise of it. A sharp experience will sufficiently instruct those who may too soon abandon legal protection. Whilst in the majority of men there is such a love of tried arrangements and so great a dread of experiments that they will probably not act upon this right until long after it is safe to do so. That was a really cool chapter. A rather awkward doctrine, this. Oh, that's good. That's really good. If the next one is short, I'll do it today. Otherwise, it will have to come tomorrow. Let me just check here. Yeah, the next one's a little long, so we're going to save it. Guys, I hope you're enjoying this. This reading had its ups and its downs, and the ups were hilarious, and the downs were something else. AnCap Gamer, you just got here right as we're ending the stream. Thanks for hanging out, guys. Thanks for participating in the comments. Let me know if you're enjoying this, and we'll leave it there. We'll continue this book tomorrow or the next day, hopefully, and just kind of keep chunking at it an hour or two at a time until we get through it. I think there's a lot of good conversation that we're going to be able to have through reading this book. So, you guys, have a great evening.